Hi, folks. Thanks for your patience. Just waiting a couple minutes to let folks trickle in. That seems to be what happens with most of these. So hello and welcome to our Fermenting Ideas talk. Tonight is the history of Elijah Bristow State Park from pre-colonization to today. My name is Dov Weinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council, and we're going to be hosting our panelists tonight. We also have our Community Engagement Coordinator, Gail Darling, doing most of the heavy lifting. So she's in the background and will be helping facilitate us through this process tonight. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are recording this presentation that allows us to be able to share it with folks who aren't able to attend tonight. You also notice that you're muted and your video is off. I'm sure this is fine with most everyone, but it also certainly allows our presenters to go through their material without getting disturbed. We're really happy for folks to ask questions at any point during the presentations by using that Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be actually answering questions at the end of the presentations. Gail will also be helping us by sharing important links and information in the chat throughout the presentation tonight, so please keep your eye on that. The Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council is a nonprofit operating just outside of Eugene. Our mission is to work with communities for a healthy Middle Fork Willamette watershed through both environmental education and habitat restoration. Our watershed stretches from Springfield all the way to Waldo Lake and Diamond Peak, and we work with both private landowners and public agencies. I want to acknowledge that our work in the Middle Fork Willamette watershed spans Kalapuya, Malala, Klamath, and Tenino lands. We want to recognize that the reciprocal relationship of Native peoples and the watershed for their life-sustaining practices. We also want to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices that were forced upon them. We're committed to listening to, learning from, and supporting Indigenous peoples, exploring the decolonization of our restoration work, and rethinking how we engage with community members on traditional lands. Before I introduce our panelists, I'll say that the work of our watershed is often dependent on the generosity of community members and partners within and outside of our watershed. So if you're interested in supporting that work, please visit our website. And I think, Gail, if you could put a link in the chat to help people out, that would be great. So first, I'd like to give short bios for each of our presenters. David Lewis is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, a descendant of the Sentium, Tacoma, and Chinook people of Oregon. He has a PhD from the University of Oregon and teaches at Oregon State University. He's a researcher, presenter, and writer of many histories of the tribes of the region. And many essays are collected on his blog site, ndnhistoryresearch.com. And I think Gail will probably also be putting that in the chat for folks. David lives in Salem with his wife, Donna, and his sons, Haley and Inatai. Sean Stewart is a park ranger with Oregon State Parks for the last 17 years and has worked in parks for 23 years. He has a Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Natural Resources from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and he lives with his wife and 2 kids in Eugene. So I'm going to step aside now and let our presenters share their wealth of knowledge with you. And first up, we have David. I'll give you the road, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Dov. Great to be here. I just noticed that Gail posted the wrong address in the chat. That's for Middle Fork. Anyway, so just want to let you know. So I have a presentation for you. Let me get that going, and we'll get started because we need to get that going. So let's see. There we go. And my words went away. I'm not sure why the words went away. There you go. Oh, I must put on a timer. All right. So thanks for being here. I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Saniam, Tacoma, and Chinook descendant. So, and I'm actually a descendant of some of the peoples I'll be talking about today, the distant relative, what we call in Native country shirt tail relative. And so let me get started on our slides here. First off, here are essentially the Kalapuya homelands on one map. We see in this sort of grayish blue, this whole area from the Tualatin on down. The people we'll talk about today primarily will be some of the Yankala people and some of the other Kalapuya people in this area. The tribes had many names. There's many nations, bands. There was not one overarching sort of tribal government, but instead many different tribes in different areas. And so the peoples that we'll talk about today are, again, Yankala, probably relations with the Winfili and some of the Mohawk peoples in this area. I also have some new research to share with you tonight, never shared before on any kind of any presentation. So these names over here on the right side are some of the common names we have for many tribes today, and how they're sort of written in various archaeological and linguistic texts. And so you can see there's a lot of different ways of spelling these names. A little bit, there's not going to be a lot on culture in this presentation. It's more about history and a little bit of genealogy. But this is the only full-length image of a Kalapuya man we have. It came out of the Wilkes expedition, 1841. I did a little bit of colorization of what it might look like. I probably need to ask somebody who's a professional to do this work. It looks more like a kid's drawing right here. So, but anyway, this is what we have for the Kalapuya man. I think he was probably related to either the Yankala or the Long Tom area tribes because of where the expedition encountered him about a day's travel south of the Eugene area, so Long Tom area. So there's about 8 different descriptions of him. If you want to look at the Oregon Encyclopedia, there's actually a pretty good write-up, which I did, I think, of him and various encounters with his party. So if you want to take a look at that. The Kalapuyans had a fairly complex society, including they knew about different seasons. They followed plant cycles. They would plan ahead, plan what they're doing for the year. They didn't wander around the landscape. They actually moved around in search of different foods, so they knew where they would be, and probably visit these same places for harvesting camas and wapato and other plants, and fishing and hunting the same way for hundreds if not thousands of years. So this calendar is collected from the Tualatin people in 1877 at the Grand Ronde Reservation. So and we can see on here, if you read a little bit on here, it says in the 8th month, and I can't even say these words, it's their tribal name for their tribal month, which is actually a description of pounding the cooked camas. So this probably take place in the middle of summertime. And here's camas, and we've just gone through a massive camas cycle in the valley. We're kind of at the tail end of camas flowering, at least. We're going into camas turning to seed, and right now the seed bulbs are still green for the most part, and in about 3 weeks or so, maybe a month, they'll turn a brown color, and they'll be nice little bells. And so if you walk through a camas field, you'll know it because the little seeds will be ringing. And that's exactly the time when you're supposed to be harvesting camas. And the camas bulbs come out of the ground. They look, they can be peeled down to a whitish look, like right here. And they're very nutritious. I would not eat them raw if you ever do this. Definitely cook them. The best way to cook them, unless you know how to build a pit oven in the ground would be to probably put them in your crock pot with a little bit of water for a couple days, or in your oven with a little bit of moisture for a couple days, and let them turn their starches into sugars and stuff. So, but the flour has become a symbol of the Kalapuya people because there was at least so much camas in this valley, and Kalapuyans really, in many ways, base their whole culture around when they're harvesting camas. So this presentation will be mostly about the Southern Valley Kalapuyans, a lot about the Yoncalla peoples. We know quite a bit about one man named Chief Halo, who is said to have come and lived most of his life at the town of Yoncalla today, where the Applegates lived. And he may have lived most of his life there, but he grew up, or his younger years were at a town on the Row River. There's an Indian town there that's located on the GLO maps, the General Land Office maps. And they knew, they have a notation in the maps, in the journals of the maps, that said this is Chief Halo Tooth's Indian Town, 5 chains north. And so this was Halo. The story was that he was born under a tree, I think it was called an oak tree, somewhere along this river, about a mile from his village. But this was his father's village until it was basically overran by settlers and they had to move. We have some interaction with Elijah Bristow, perhaps not well known. He actually was as you will hear, he was a very early settler. He was actually very concerned about post offices for some reason. I think he was helping to set up the initial post office route in his area. He wanted his town or his place to be recognized. And so he sent a letter to Joseph Lane, who was the governor of Oregon at the time, in 1854, and asked that they establish a couple post offices down in his vicinity. And he said it was first at the house of Greenberry B. Pierce, who should be appointed postmaster. Post office would be called Camaswale. So we have, even today, a Camaswale on the highway. If you go on I-5, there's a Camaswale area. So that's probably exactly somewhere near there. 6 miles from here, large populous neighborhood who much need an office. The other would be the house of Henry Small, 6 miles further, who should be appointed postmaster. This is a place where the office of ground was granted and was by request of Mr. Small, but I believe the majority of that people, with myself, would much prefer the name Milpoo or Milpoo Illy, as that is the Indian name for the place. Now, we have never, there's more to be said. There's a lot, this actually letter goes on for a while, but I don't know if we know what Milpoo means. I haven't actually looked it up in our dictionary yet, or figured out what it means in Kalapuyan or perhaps Chinook. It's probably a Kalapuyan word, but Ili definitely is a Chinook Wawa word meaning land. So it's something land. And so it's interesting that he wanted to incorporate some of these sort of almost like native terms into the post office. So that suggests he had a lot of interaction with the tribes, with Kalapuya people and other people in the area. And I've seen other stories that he had some respect to the tribes in the area. They respected him as an early settler. So and we may hear some stories about that later on. But in this area of the valley, there was a good number of tribal people, as we know, and they all signed on to the Willamette Valley Treaty in 1855. And these are the listed tribes in the treaty. And literally 4 days ago, I would have told you that this was the complete list, and that there was no Nepechuk, there was no Klatskanai, and there was no Santiam Forks Malala or Mountain Malala on the treaty at all. I added these things literally today, these words today, because I just found in federal records 2 new pages to the Willamette Valley Treaty. The treaty actually ceded 19 million acres to the United States from these tribes, all these tribes. I'll get to the pages in a second, but after the treaty, Joel Palmer, who was Indian agent at the time, Indian superintendent for Oregon at the time, needed to move the tribes away from settlements, because there's a lot of folks that didn't like Indian people that wanted to commit genocide on them. So he decided to place them on temporary reservations for a time. And so I have documented a number of temporary reservations in the vicinity of where the area we're talking about. There's the Mohawk Band of Kalapuya Reservation in 1855, and here's kind of what they said about it. It was near William Simmons and James Scott allotments, or actually donation land claims, in what's now called the Mohawk Valley, which is obviously an imposed name. We think that actually name of that area was the Paiute area, because we have a name on maps saying it was the Paiute people or Paiute River in that area. So so those folks jointly managed a tribe of Indians for about 9 or 10 months. And they kept them there until 1856 when they were removed. See, these are out of order. So let me just go on to what it says right here. So here's one of the first new signature pages. Signatures of the Klatskanai and the Nepechuk. I got this out of the M234 microfilm series, which is letters to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. And if you look on this page, these pages were just randomly stuck in the microfilm rolls without really an intro to them. And you see the Klatskanai and Nepechuk bands of the Nepechuk tribe being duly authorized. Our respective bands give our assent and agree to the provisions of the foregoing treaty. So this is signed apparently sometime in January, but for some reason it didn't get to. It says 20th day of January, but some reasons it was not sent with the treaty, which was sent about that time on January 22nd or so to Washington, D.C. I think there is a notation in another letter, if I'll have to go back and find it, that suggests that he knew that this tribe hadn't signed on the treaty yet, and he had to get their signatures later. So he probably produced this document earlier, didn't have the signatures yet, went ahead and sent the treaty to Washington, D.C. and collected the signatures later on after this 20th date of January. Later on, next this is another page of signatures, that of the Malala people, and this actually complicates our story here quite a bit of the peoples in this on the Middle Fork. We see the signatures of the chiefs of the Santiam Forks Band of Malalas and a band called the Mountain Band of Malalas. And this, I think, if I'm right, is what we call the Tufty Band, who apparently had a village somewhere around the area of Oak Ridge. So, and it says, we, the chief of the Santiam Forks Band of Malalas and the chief of the Chiween Santiam Band of Indians, being duly authorized for respective bands, give our assent and agree to the provisions of the foregoing treaty. So there's one here, and then the next one is we, the headmen of the Mountain Band of Malalas, being duly authorized, same verbiage, but on March, what appears to be 5th or 6th at Spores Ferry. Oregon Territory. So this man, Little Chief, and I don't know, it looks like Trist, or Bent Trist, or Ben Little Chief, Ben Trist, maybe, were representing their tribe, and this is, I believe, is this sort of not much known about them band of Malala Indians that lived up that valley up towards Oak Ridge. And when I say not much known about them, it's because there is not much ethnographically known about them at all. They were removed fairly early, and nobody really sort of studied them. We have some history on them, but that whole Middle Fork area was then likely shared between Calipuians and Malalas jointly, with some sort of dividing line there. Here's some of the other timber reservation pages, which I got out of order. So here's the Mohawk Reservation. We see in the GLO maps this area of the Mohawk River, where it shows the Scott allotment right here, or the Scott in the Simond area over here, which is today on where Marcola Road is. And then we have another timber reservation of the Chafin Band, which was located very much near where the bridge is for I-5, where it says, the Spores Ferry area. I think it's called the Spores Bridge or something. But I figure this area right here alongside the riverbank is probably where that timber reserve was for the Chafin Band. This is also the place where a famous Indian woman, Indian Eliza Young of Brownsville, kind of grew up in the Spores homestead. I believe they taught her a lot of sort of home care skills, like cooking, cleaning, and laundry and stuff like that. And that she left after she got married and moved up to Brownsville and had a couple of adventures up there. But she probably, some of the records suggest that she was actually from the Paiute Band, and she had moved there, been moved to that reservation here at Spores, and was taken in by the Spores family during that temporary reservation period. So we sort of know where that place is too. The other tribes we know about the area, people who know about the area, are the Chief Halo people, like I mentioned Halo earlier. Well, after the reservation's created, Halo never actually goes to Grand Ronde. He's one of the few Native people with his family that remained off reservation. He remains with the Applegate family and becomes sort of lifetime friends with them and their families thereafter. Between the Halo clan and the Applegates have been friends ever since. But his kids, the Fern brothers, have a lot of, they take off reservation allotments in the vicinity of Cottage Grove, between Cottage Grove and Yoncalla, more closer actually to Cottage Grove, and they run various labor businesses out of Cottage Grove, usually sort of moving timber around, getting firewood, things like that. They work very hard their whole lives. We have, and these are them. This is Jake Fern right here. This is BL. This is Sam Fern, and this is Mac Fern. These are all the sons of Chief Halo. Very well-known men in Cottage Grove at the time. Very well respected, actually, because they worked very hard for money and stuff. We also have some stories of Halo and what he did when the Americans basically took over the whole area and he had to sort of live with them. We know that he worked with a man named Mr. Walker, and they built a fish trap, probably in a weir in the middle of the river, and they took turns clearing out that fish trap every day. And apparently Halo liked the eels, so Walker would bring the eels to him all the time. So we know Halo had some positive interactions with people in the area. And I started doing a little bit of research on the genealogy of these people, and it went in crazy directions. So we have this sort of origin with this Clackamas, Klamath, Kalapuyan connection up here. Chief Halito, who grew up, that's the original chief, grew up on the Row River. He has Chief Halo. His sons are Jake Biel, Sam Fern. They are, the rest of it, he has a daughter, Pat. He's got a son who becomes under the name of Fisherman Bristow, which is quite interesting, but because it seems like he was probably friends with Elijah Bristow. It was pretty common for Native people to take the names of settlers as kind of a honorific kind of ways, but he took the name Bristow. And another daughter, Mary Jones. Some of these people go to Grand Ronde. This whole area over here goes to Grand Ronde. The whole area on the right side also goes to Grand Ronde, the fishermen's. Some fishermen stay off reservation, some come to the tribe. But definitely Polk Scott is living at the tribe. The Heartlesses, the Hudsons, they're all living at the tribe, but they're all related. The Gilberts, the Savages, they come to the tribe. And we see spores of the tribe too at Grand Ronde. Another branch of the family from Fisherman Bristow are the Tufties, and these are the Malala peoples. I'm not sure about this genealogy, but at the end result we know about is Charlie Tufty, who's at Warm Springs. These people go to Warm Springs instead. So we have this interesting mixture of different cultures, which was probably very common at the time, of Yankala, Malala, Saniam, and Upper Umpqua peoples marrying in with Clackamas, Klamath peoples, and they're related to the Saniam peoples as well. So we have all these people all related to one another in a pretty wide range area. And I know it looks confusing, it's confusing to me, but this is pretty interesting to me to sort of figure out who's related to who and how we're related between the reservations and stuff. All right, so this creates a large sort of interfamily group of interfamily relationships, and I'm actually related to this whole family through the Hudson family on the Hudson family side, because one of Chief Halo's wives, and he had several wives, leaves him and goes to Grand Ronde and marries my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. So all right, so people moved to the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation around 1856. Palmer is forced to sort of move everybody really quickly in 1856 because there's a lot of activation against tribes. A lot of settlers want to kill all the tribes as a genocide. And Palmer, the Indian agent, is supposed to be preserving them and saving them as much as possible. He's actually a very moral, very Christian man, and he wants to save them. And so he quickly works with the U.S. Army to move people out of all the temporary reservations, move on at Grand Ronde. So within some 5 months, between January and May, the majority of people are moved out of Northern Oregon and even Southern Oregon to Grand Ronde and parts of the Coast Reservation. And the rest of the people arrive later on after the River Renewal War is done, and they move up the coast or on steamships up to Portland and down through the valleys to Grand Ronde. So that's at that point too. But we can see a crazy mixture of peoples at the reservation, and it mentions Rogue Rivers, Umpquas, Kalapuyas, Klamaths, Malalas, and Tualatans. So we have in all, by say November of 1856, we have between 27 and 35 tribes at Grand Ronde, members of those tribes at Grand Ronde. We have, and then after the reservation is settled, people are not really allowed to leave. They're not American citizens. They're not don't have freedom to move around in now what's the American area. So they're forced to stay on the reservation and get passes if they want to leave. But yet people still leave. They get a pass. They leave for some purpose. They get that permission from the Indian agents, and they have numerous adventures in the southern Valley. I was able to go to Cottage Grove and get a lot of information through their archives there and through the various museums and archives there. And so we found out that in Cottage Grove, there is a heritage fair area. And that was the area where, in terms of this story right here, the tribes would meet up there and have what they call a camp meeting in the summertime. And they would talk about, their past and their stories, and they would have a meeting with different peoples, including Klamaths and Kalapuas and Malalas and peoples at the location. And so that is pretty interesting. We got that from Gene Savage, who wrote about it in his Looking Back. I think it was a series in the newspaper. There are also a good number of meetings for various events up near Oak Ridge as well. So here's a story this is back in late 1871. There were small isolated groups of Indians living in Oak Ridge and Cottage Grove. These two groups were related and often visited back and forth. During these visits, the Indians at Oak Ridge took over all the ponies and dogs to the settlement near Cottage Grove. The Cottage Grove Indian returned the visit. At times, the population of Indians settlements would swell to almost 100. It was unlawful Indians to homestead land. A man by the name of Black changed the name of the Indians, and after considerable difficult, two Indians, Charlie Tufty and James Chuck succeeded in homesteading and securing title to 2 parcels of land, 80 acres each. And that's that Tufty off-reservation allotment is the subject of much debate today. I mean, there's people that have said that they want to somehow get that back or preserve it or something, but it's probably not possible. But it would be nice to document that, because he was one of the few Native people that got off-reservation allotments up in the Oak Ridge area, and really kind of back in his own land in a sense. So there's lots of stories here. Other stories, pretty common throughout the valley, the Indians were in large numbers coming to Lowell to pick hops. Hop yards there, they would return across the summit with salmon, dried fruits, some green fruits, and clothing, pick huckleberries and hunt in the vicinity of Rigdon and across the Willamette Pass just prior to the snowstorms early fall. So probably talking about Klamath peoples. So there was a pretty common route coming over what's called the Klamath Trail into the Eugene Springfield area, coming right down through the Pleasant Hill area. And so that was pretty common activity in that area. So we have one other story about Chief Fisherman Bristow, was a treacherous, troublesome character here during the 50s and 60s. The surly old chief was given the name Bristow after the grand old pioneer Elijah Bristow, who settled Pleasant Hill in 1846, and who exerted a powerful influence over this wily old brave who was the chief of the Pleasant Hill band of Kalapuas. In 1878, there was quite a flourishing Indian village just back of the McFarland Hill, south of town, among the most noted Indians being Jack, Polk Scott, Jerry, Bob, Indian Sam, probably Fisherman, and Enoch, probably Fern, the sole survivor of the tribe. This is in a newspaper. Pretty interesting that this is going on, that there was actually quite a bit of interaction with tribal people up in the Pleasant Hill area at that time. We have some pictures from that time period, or relatively in that time period, maybe somewhat later. This picture right here on the left side, upper left-hand side, is of a stick game tournament, which is a gambling game, kind of athletic gambling game between, it was said, Grand Ron and Sluts Indians at Springfield. These other pictures are from the Springfield Historical Society, and they're pictures of Indian kids or people, probably the suggestion is that they're Wasco or Warm Springs people that would come into the Springfield area all the time to pick vegetables in the summer times. And so there was like little indigenous farm worker camps, literally, in Springfield that would sort of help them out. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate that. And we've had several questions pop in, but I think what we'll do is hold those to the end after Sean's talk. and then we'll get to everybody's questions, some interesting questions coming in. So appreciate your talk, and we'll have you back at the end, David. And I want to hand it off to Sean to continue the story.
Okay, thank you, Gail, and thank you, David. I'll throw out one source that I had. I'll talk about Elijah Bristow just slightly. But an illustrated history of Lane County, Oregon is one viewpoint of the history of Lane County, right? And it has a fair amount of information about Elijah Bristow, and it does have some information about Native Americans. Again, it is just one viewpoint. But if you Google illustrated history of Lane County, Oregon, you can get the ebook. And I found it very interesting. I won't go into what it says. I'll let people figure that out for themselves. But I will be talking mainly about the very short history of Elijah Bristow just prior to when it became a park, and since it has been a park. And so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, we start out, if those of you who aren't familiar with Oregon State Parks, we do have a mission statement, as all good government agencies do. But ours is to provide and protect our cultural, historic, and recreation sites. And Elijah Bristow is such a great park because it does have a little bit of everything. And we have been working quite hard to not only provide recreation, but set it up for the future generations. So my talk be brief, but history of Elijah Bristow State Park. What was here before, and that before is, of course, after the settlement and after the removal of what we just heard was almost all of the Native Americans. I'll touch on the Willamette River Greenway program. How do we make a park? Briefly on who is Elijah Bristow. Include the last 50 years, and then the next 50 years is what we really should be thinking about for those future generations. So what was here before this became Elijah Bristow State Park? So Elijah Bristow State Park was a ranching and farming area before it was talked about being made a park. And this picture you see here, the red is the outline of the park. And you can see from this aerial photo the remnants of its past uses. It was made up of 16 different properties that now total 847 acres. And you can see the farming areas outlined in green. And we call them meadows sometimes, or fields, but they were really agricultural areas, either for haying or vegetable crops, and those cycled over the years as fields do. There was also grazing. A little bit upstream, we have gravel mining. And on the very upstream end, just past the park, you can see the main feature of our area, which is Dexter Dam. And so farming and ranching continued even into the 2000s within the park. We had agricultural lease agreements, which are more prevalent in the northern valley, say at Willamette Mission. However, we did have some for haying. So areas of the park by the dog park in the front of the park, if you're familiar, was hayed up until 2007, which has a drastic effect on the park area. Our stock gravel mining picture. This is not what it looks like, but I don't have any photos of the actual gravel mining. But as is the case around Eugene and Springfield area, there are a lot of gravel mines. It's a geologist, geomorphologist perspective. Eugene, Springfield, Dexter, all these areas sit on basically a giant alluvial fan of gravel, where the Mackenzie and the Middle Fork and the Coast Fork pour out of the mountains. It gets flat, they drop out all their gravel. And a lot of these gravel areas were reclaimed and became parks. And our biggest gravel areas right now are at the confluence of the Mackenzie and the Willamette River, Delta, Aggie, other sand and gravels. So this was continued into the 70s, and after it was state park land for a few years, there was a lease that continued. The main item of development that has affected the park is Dexter Dam and Lookout Point Dam above it. These two dams were built in 1954, some of the earliest in the valley after the Cottage Grove Dam. And this has drastically changed the area of the park. And it is something you have to look to notice, but we will talk a little bit more about this. But the dam has provided for recreation. It's heavily used. Most importantly, it and Lookout Point has stopped most of the flooding of the Eugene-Springfield area, and especially Elijah Bristow State Park being immediately downstream of the dam. However, it is also, as many of you may know, it has blocked upstream fish passage. You can see my cursor right here on the north end of the dam is the powerhouse. Next to that is the fish collection station. This is the end of the road for a lot of fish naturally swimming. Here they get put into trucks and either taken up to Oak Ridge Fish Hatchery if they're hatchery fish, or if they are some of the few wild fish left, they are transported above the dams all the way up above Hills Creek and to the North Fork, Middle Fork above West Fur, where they are allowed to spawn naturally. However, most fish are hatchery fish, and if you've ever been fishing or visited this area during a run, this is wall-to-wall anglers here along both banks. There is no fish ladder on any of these dams from Dexter upstream. It has also stopped gravel, mainly up at Lookout Point, but you have clear cold water coming out of the powerhouses, and that natural flood, gravel movement, sediment. The river in Bristow is a remarkable blue-green, even during the biggest storms, and that gravel is no longer moving through the system. So those are what was happening before the park. Now, to create the park, it was first envisioned as part of the Willamette River Greenway, and that itself is a huge topic. But very briefly, the idea came up in 1966 during the governor's race, and it came into being in a form, not its original form. The original form was a massive greenway on both sides of the river from the Columbia up to Eugene area. And many parks were funded and built in the cities. In Lane County, quite a few more because the county was involved. But most of the rural land and intact forest land was not purchased at the time due to a lack of funds and pushback from farmers and other folks who did not want to give their land to the government, to give away productive agricultural land. So it does exist, Willamette River Greenway. We have a Willamette River Water Trail, which is a gem, but not very well known. And it's getting more known each year, but the Willamette has often been kind of a forgotten part of the valley. And more towns are now turning, instead of turning their backs to the river, so to speak, turning towards the river. And Eugene is a good example of that. This picture is Pangra, River Mile 201, in case you're curious. That's from the mouth of the river. And this is directly across from Elijah Bristow State Park. So Elijah Bristow State Park was envisioned as one of the anchors of the Willamette River Greenway. What turned into Willamette Mission State Park, Malala River State Park, Bowers Rock State Park, and Elijah Bristow State Park were supposed to be the big anchor parks along the river. So, like I said, the park came out of this idea for recreation and preservation of the river. And it was 16 properties. The state of Oregon paid $980,000 in total, which is over $6.5 million, according to an online appreciation calculator. So $6.5 million for this 850 acres today. And a lot of this was paid for by the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a federal program still around today, which uses monies from offshore oil, gas, other fees paid to public lands to protect land. And Oregon State Parks, like many areas in the country, use this money to purchase property. And if you look carefully, you can often see the little Land and Water Conservation signs funded. It's a much bigger version of what Oregon State Parks does with lottery money, which is pass it through to smaller agencies to build playgrounds, trails, etc. And so sometimes you'll see our little shield saying this park or this project is funded by Oregon State Parks. It's passed through money, and just a little details on the behind the scenes on how parks get made. So recreation was the key. That was the focus of Elijah Bristow State Park when it was created. Oops, sorry. So we have our, of course, drift boat. This is the north channel of the river around our large island. So we have boating. Of course, we have a large equestrian use, hiking, bird watching, you name it. That's what they wanted the park to be used for, and even more. It was actually, the master plan called for campgrounds, a water ski lake up north or upstream on the river, big grand developments. And like a lot of things, this was scaled back over the years. So the park was created for recreation, but also, there was some foresight and natural areas. Oregon was very progressive in that way with the Oregon coast, but also the Greenway and other parks on not just creating playgrounds and campgrounds, but also creating natural areas for wildlife and habitat. And so for basically the 50 years now that the park has been envisioned, that has been one of the purposes of this park, is to preserve a little bit of the natural environment, and it turns out very close to a large urban area. Now, restoration has picked up quite a bit in the last 20 years. In 2001, state parks started working quite a lot with the Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council, and Elijah Bristow was a main focus, especially the Lost Creek area, for restoration. This is a group on a river float / Scotch broom pulling. You can see this pile of Scotch broom that's about doubly tall. These folks are actually facing what would have been the water ski lake if that had come to fruition. Thankfully, with Dexter just upstream, the need for a water ski lake on the river was not realized, and now it's home to waterfowl and turtles and salmon, which I personally think is a much better use. We've in the last 20 years, we've had a lot of groups come out and help with our restoration. You pick a youth group, we've had them out. This is an AmeriCorps group from all across the country. A great project. This is on Lost Creek in the winter, so the water's a little higher. They're planting willow stakes located here in the boat. pounding willow stakes into this cut bank. And this area here, just a little bit of history on it, it's such a small piece of land, but this used to grow hops, among other things. And David had talked about hop fields. This area was still growing hops as of at least 3 years ago. But we are trying, because it was plowed and no riparian vegetation left, Lost Creek was cutting into it, and you can see that is just beautiful soil. And it will grow anything, including weeds, quite well. Some of those weeds that we deal with, and if you've lived around here, you know your weeds. However, one of the things we've noticed is Scotch broom has really taken hold in the park. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but it prefers drier areas. And if you've been to Elijah Bristow in the winter, you know it is a very, very wet place. However, it was much wetter in the past. And with climate change and Dexter Dam, the area has dried out quite a bit. So we are battling things like Scotch broom, which thrive on that dry soil. Also, we have rose campion, beautiful flower in a garden, not so good along our trails. It also loves dry, as does false brome. And so we've come to recognize these weeds, and I won't show pictures of blackberry because we have that everywhere. But one of the outcomes of Bristow's past, Elijah Bristow State Park's past as a ranch and agricultural area, is the land was worked. It's disturbed. It was worked by the people. Very little of it was untouched by people's hands. And as they continued to work it, they could keep the weeds down like you do in your garden, or things are grazed down. However, when it became a park, that cattle, most of that ag leasing, all that activity stopped, and nature reclaimed it. However, once you touch something, it's really hard to go back to that untouched wilderness aspect. So weeds have become a major problem in the park, and that's what we do spend a lot of time on. But why? You know, Scotch broom is pretty. I still think it can be pretty, although it's tough. It's tough to look past it. Rose campion, blackberries are tasty, good pollinating. Why are we doing all this restoration? Well, it's mainly for the wildlife. We have such a big area. In the grand scheme of things, 850 acres is not huge, but it is big for this area. Western pond turtle is one of our more charismatic species that we are protecting. And this little guy or girl, I don't actually know, you can't tell, is about the size of a quarter. And Western pond turtles do live and breed in the park. We have our Chinook salmon. We have steelhead in the park. We have Oregon chub, which was recently delisted from the endangered species list. Fox, bear, cougar, you know, anything you find in this area, Elijah Bristow provides a nice refuge where you can see it, as well as elk, deer, larger game animals. So most of our projects are focused on helping one or more species of concern that we have. In addition, so we have our restoration, we have our recreation. We also have been working on education, and Elijah Bristow provides a great outdoor classroom. This feels more and more like a plug for Elijah Bristow, but hey, why not? It's a great spot. Pleasant Hill, Jasper, and Lowell schools, as well as now Springfield schools, have all used Elijah Bristow for outdoor education. This was Students Protecting Endangered Wildlife Club at Pleasant Hill, SPEW, a great name that only teenagers could come up with. It is getting to about 15 years of students pulling Scotch broom and protecting habitat. This is one of our turtle nesting areas. You have our native Oregon grape, invasive Scotch broom, and this grassy meadow areas are where the turtles like to nest. So the kids are out in the park learning and doing service projects. This is, I believe, Lundy Elementary out in Lost Creek, collecting macroinvertebrates and studying. And so it's something you just can't get inside of a classroom. And luckily, we are so close to several schools that we've been able, partnering with the Watershed Council, to get kids out. And this is really where I think the strength of the greatness of this park is if we can create the next generation of stewards. We had land stewards before the settlers came, of course, and they utilized the land, the Native Americans, and they did manipulate the land, but they also had a kind of balance, not to romanticize it, but it's something that we need to have as a balance in these places, our state parks that we have, and getting these kids out into the creek. I mean, I don't take pictures of faces because they're kids, but they all have smiles. You know, what's better than getting out of the classroom and tromping in the creek? And so it builds that land ethic, that stewardship, to protect this area and improve this area after people like myself are long gone. And so lastly, I want to talk about the future. I said the next 50 years of Elijah Bristow State Park. And one of the things that we're all aware of in this area is flooding. And we have our series of dams now to protect our developed areas, Eugene, Springfield, Crestwell, Cottage Grove, and downstream from flooding. One of the great things about Elijah Bristow State Park is it does have Lost Creek, which normally runs back in this tree line, which is an undammed tributary, the furthest upstream tributary of the Willamette that is not dammed. And it will flood. This was 2006, not long after I started here. This is our park road. This is our turtle nesting areas. The creek is running way high and across our road. And it's that kind of flooding and dynamic nature that created a lot of the landforms. I talked about those dry land weedy species. When the dam cut off that gravel, Dexter Dam on Lookout Point, the river cut down. And so Elijah Bristow, as wet as it gets on occasion, is now 5 to 10 feet above the river, whereas before the river was braided all through the area. And this has caused a lot of change in the park. And so flooding is something that is only a problem if it affects us, right? A lot of nature has adapted to flooding. And so flooding happens when we have a road, say here, that we have to close the park, or when floodwaters, this is our Channel Lake area, impacts our trail structures, our bridges. Another picture, this is, I believe, 2008. Lost Creek came up, of course, wasn't able to get out there when the creek was up high, but it flowed. This is about 100 yards from the creek and cut down irrigation, trail damage, etc. So how can we maintain and improve the park, knowing that climate change is going to affect the park and flooding may affect the park? And indeed, do we want more flooding in the park? Is that something this park can be a sponge, because we're not going to, of course, flood Jasper or Springfield or Eugene. Those are unacceptable. That's why we have the dams. However, we have this big area that can act as that sponge, and perhaps we can let nature do some of the restoration work. We obviously have done a lot. You can see we're planting trees here and the like. Another example of of Lost Creek doing what it does? And can we take that view of, yes, this creek moves and it is good. It is good for it to move. It is us as land managers, as a ranger myself, to say, okay, well, we can move this trail rather than say armor this with rock or try to control nature in the park. Maybe we let nature do its thing and we adapt. So that's one vision of the future of Elijah Bristow State Park. And so we hope it continues to be a refuge for animals and people and wildlife, and continues to serve the folks around here. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. That was great. It's good to hear that history. I can't imagine a water ski lake in Bristow. It'd be a different place. So we do have a couple questions for both you and David. And I might just start with some for David. Looks like you may have jumped in and answered them, but I think they're ones that might be of interest to everybody. So one question back from David's talk is, could you speak on the distinction between tribe and band? Are these interchangeable or do they mean different things?
I think, it's hard to know the difference. I think that generally all villages had their own autonomy and had their own chiefs and their leaders and stuff like that. And sometimes there were smaller villages that were established that politically aligned themselves with the larger villages, and they would then be a band of the larger tribe based on their political allegiances to the larger tribe. So sometimes, I'm not really sure what the rules are, frankly, how folks were labeled. I mean, for example, we have the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians, which in reality is a tribe, would be actually considered a tribe because they're large enough to be a full-on tribe. And there was never, the Cow Creeks were not actually a part of the other Umpqua tribes that spoke a totally different language. So they're actually more related to the Takelmas. So yeah, there's no real, in terms of like historic naming, I'm not sure, there's no rule there, but generally the band was usually smaller, was kind of an outpost, maybe a newer village of peoples that had moved away from the major tribe to start their own village under their own leader, and were usually aligned to the larger tribe.
Great, thanks. And then another one from your talk, David, from the chat box. One question was about the tribe signing on to the agreements, and the question is, given that the local tribes probably didn't read English, what confidence is there in the signatures regarding what they were agreeing to?
Yeah, there was quite a few people by that time, the time of treaties, that spoke Chinookwawah language. Palmer had been in Oregon since 1845, and most of the early settlers learned to speak Chinookwawah pretty early because it's actually a fairly easy language to learn when you're essentially exposed to Native people all the time. And he was good friends with them. I think he spoke the Chinookwawah language, and then he also had translators with him during when they had their treaty meetings and stuff. So I know that George Gibbs was hired to be a translator. So George Gibbs is a pretty well-known, today considered an anthropologist, early anthropologist in the Oregon area, and he absolutely did know Chinookwawah and spoke with people using the language.
Great, thanks. Sean, a question for you, and it looks like you might be putting some in the chat box now, but what were the farms that were purchased to make up Elijah Bristow Park? And I'm kind of curious, yeah, kind of how many, and this question asker was curious about the names of farms or farmers.
Yes, so there was 16 properties total So by the time of 1971 to 1976 is when these properties were purchased. And to my knowledge, they were all purchased willingly, no condemnation, although that was used in other areas of the state. And so I listed the names, the last names from our deeds that we have. So at this point in time, though, land grants, things like that were broken up basically into lots and properties the same size they are today. For example, Elijah Bristow did a donation land claim at Pleasant Hill because he was married, 640 acres, I believe. And those were scattered around. And David mentioned some of the early ones a little bit north as well. So scattered through, and if you look at the, if you go to Lane County tax lot maps, if you are so interested, it can be interesting. You can see all the different tax lot maps, and it is really convoluted because the river changed course quite often before the dam. And so property lines properties were split on either side of the rivers. And but the list I made was all of the last names of the landowners, and there was a large section that was owned by Lane County. And if I had to guess, I would say that and the Army Corps of Engineers public land was part of the impetus for where this park was located. There was a chunk of public land that could be built around, as well as its location on the upper end of the river, again, as an anchor property.
Great. All right, that's all the questions we have for now, but we'll give people a second. If anyone has additional questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box or the question and answer box down at the bottom. And we can get those right on here. If something comes up to you or you'd like to ask a question after the presentation, please just shoot me an email and we'll get those on to Sean and David and get those questions answered for you too, because I know sometimes things come up later. And just while we're waiting too, I'll mention we are recording this presentation. So we will be sharing that out to everyone who registered, so you can go back and watch it again or share it with somebody who you think might be interested. So again, if questions pop up at that point, please let us know. But
It's like you're pretty successful. Nobody has any questions.
I was gonna say you guys answered all the questions in your presentations.
That's to be expected because we do know everything.
It's
That's
true.
right.
It's true. That's why we invited you here this evening. All righty.
It looks like somebody answered the names of the people in the chat box.
Yeah, Sean
Landowners.
popped in those, and we'll share that information too. We should be able to make that available with the recording when we share that out, the chat information. And I'll also make sure all the links that we've shared in there, we'll make sure to send those up in a follow-up email as well. So David's website and the information that Sean shared about the book.
There's something from John Mullen in the questions. I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, that's a good question.
John, do you want to explain that further in the chat? Or
Yeah.
I think I know what he's talking about, but as I mentioned in that illustrated history of Lane County, which it's a history of Lane County, but it was actually first written in 1880s. So it was more contemporaneous than say something now. Go in there and read about Elijah Bristow, and there's different accounts, and like I said, it's one viewpoint. But I can just say that I did not find it a incredibly favorable viewpoint of Elijah Bristow, even though it thought it was being favorable of him. If that entices you to read the controversy of it, but there's a lot of good info in there, and again, I don't think it should be taken as gospel, so to speak, but there's also articles, I believe, that John is referring to that reference different aspects of Elijah Bristow. And he also had, of course, a fair number of children. And one of his sons, I know, was, I believe, a state rep or state senator, a judge, helped bring the U of O to Eugene. So there's a lot of Bristows out there. And so this was just the first. So be careful when you read that you're referring to the correct Bristow, because Lane County is rife with them.
Good point.
There's 2 more questions. Is that right? 1 more question?
I think that's clarification on the first one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I think unless folks have more questions, and again, like I said, please feel free to reach out and we can forward any further questions and get those answered. But unless I see anything pop up here right at the end, and I apologize, I'm looking at a different screen. I just want to thank Sean and David so much for joining us tonight and sharing all this information and giving us such a nice, rich history of the Elijah Bristow area. It's just adds so much to what we know of a park that we already all love so much. So we really appreciate you both being here. Thanks to everyone who's here tonight listening and for spending the last hour and a half with us, learning with us. We really appreciate your time and being here at our talk. Again, we'll be sharing this video with you. It will be a couple days before we get that out, but we will get that out to you so you can share it with anyone you think might be interested, and we'll also have it on our webpage. And again, if you have any questions, let me know and we can pass those on. And we just like to say again, if you enjoyed this talk and you'd like to hear others like it, please consider donating to the Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council. You can find that on our website, middleforkwillamette.org. And you can also there check out our event calendar for any other upcoming events. We'll have a few coming up this summer. Maybe still virtual, but we're hoping sometime soon to be able to see you all in person. So thank you all so much for showing up tonight and joining us. And we will hopefully see you all soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Okay, bye.
We'll see you out in the parks.